Okay. Now that we're busy and recording, I don't have a, frankly, I need you people to start doing your physiology presentations. So since when, we have what, four or five for this afternoon, we have an hour. Because Dr. Hannah has something going on. What she has, is this for zoo or, okay. So, and she's gonna use the lab. So we'll try to scoot and get this done in an hour. And then Friday, we need to have people presenting in here, and next week. So we need to get these presentations in. If I need to, I'll send you anything, other information you may or may not need. So everybody, you just saw on Wednesday, you're taking it, you have that window of time, but once you start, there's 60 minutes.
Okay.
I think there's 55 questions. You've got the study guide stuff that I verbally sent to you, and good luck. So I figured I'd do a little. I've got about another unit or two, and these are units that are informational rather than test. Yes, sir.
Is there a rubric for the presentation, or just has to be like 5 minutes?
Oh, 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
There's no rubric or anything like that. It's just I want to see your bright smiling face, and you can demonstrate your communication skills.
Okay. Sounds good.
I mean, if you're some people, I've had people who are uncomfortable. You shouldn't be at this stage of your careers. Just to get up there, some people just read their paper. I mean, some people are just, you're not good in front of an audience. To me, that's my happy place. I'm very quiet at home, but here,
Show for us.
exactly. Different. Everybody has a different persona. Yes.
Would you prefer a PowerPoint or my poster?
Either whatever you're most comfortable with. There's nothing mandatory with that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of performers historically who were like that, who were a different person when they were all, most notoriously, if that's the right word. Freddie Mercury was very over the top when he performed, relatively quiet at home. The wonderful Garden Lodge in London. Huh? Behave. Just saying. So I used to I don't do that anymore. I had a big audience, like 60 or 90 people. And this was entry-level micro students who were starting nursing at Shayside School of Nursing. For the first exam, I used to play, before, as I was passing out the exam, another one bites the dust. You got to get into their heads. You guys are veterans. So this is contextual information, and some of it I'm just going to zip through. Some of it I'll spend a little more time with. To me, the thrust of this, and we should get through this all rather expeditiously, is metabolic and respiratory acidosis, and to a lesser extent, alkalosis. I'm going to sneeze. Pardon me. No, my allergies are just horrible. Okay, so as you can see, there's so much water in our bodies, comparatively speaking. And I mean, so we're just talking about that. That's water content. I don't even think they're looking at the water balance that's contained within the cytoplasm and some of the other fluids that are there. Because I really think the number is probably closer to 70% for most. If you take into all the water that's really around. And obviously fatty tissue is the least hydrated. And so that's a significant, more than 10 gallons of fluid. And obviously as it gets lesser and lesser with time, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. So we look at the different fluid compartments that are there, and these are acronyms wherever you're going with your careers. If you're going certainly in graduate levels in science, or if you're going even in whatever world you're going into research, these are acronyms used all the time. Intracellular, extracellular fluid are part of it. So fluid inside the cells, rather substantial. Extracellular fluid, proportionately less. Plasma alone, 3 liters. Interstitial fluid, 12 liters. The fluid that's kind of between, it's really part of the interstitial fluid is really part of the extracellular fluid, lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, variety of other fluids in the abdominal pelvic cavity. There's a lot that's in there, and they give you a nice little chart to demonstrate that. We know that water is a universal solvent, and by definition, solutes. And the terms solute and solvent are important because a lot of times, wherever you're going career-wise, they'll phrase those questions that way. Rather than how much is dissolved in the water, solute and solvent. Electrolytes and non-electrolytes, so typical organic molecules, because they don't ionize within water, typically like that. So you can see a sort of a laundry list with the absence of charged particles. I know this is mostly review, but it's all saying reviews never hurt. So, and then all the different things that disassociate in water and the electrical current and the osmotic power that's associated. And of course, the hidden nugget about any of these things is it's with the osmotic force, it's about the number of particles, not the size of the particle. So mag dichloride, 3 particles, sodium chloride, 1 particle. 2 particles rather, etc. that are there. And then they go into the whole thing with, and this is something, particularly for those who may or may not be heading in a medical realm. You don't necessarily have to be an MCAT for this, or maybe in the future, as your plans change. They do talk a little bit about milliequivalents. Okay? I'm not going to ask any questions about it or anything along those lines, because you can see a milliosmol and a milliequivalent versus here, half milliosmol, 2 milliequivalents. And so a lot of times you'll see dosages, particularly intravenously, hospital-wise, they'll express them in milliequivalent. I have a motto about that if you're going into a medical field. When in doubt, ask a pharmacist. They're into that stuff. Works for me. Okay, and now the composition. We've already talked about that. Extracellularly, electrolytic contents are similar except for higher protein in extracellular fluid, lower chloride content of plasma. Sodium predominates, chloride predominates. Intracellularly, relatively low calcium and phosphate. Potassium rather than phosphate predominate. So most of the reactions, we already know about that with all of the things that are moving around with regard to the dissolved solutes really take up a lot of space, comparatively speaking. And I give you a chart that's about that. So all of these osmotic pressures and and we just finished talking about that, particularly vis-a-vis kidney. It's all about hydrostatic pressure, blood pressure, versus osmotic pressure, the force that whatever is holding the fluids in exerts on it. Okay? So when we move around the solute concentration, what's going to happen? Are we going to induce water to leave or water to enter? As we increase the extracellular fluid concentration of solutes or osmolality, we induce water to leave. And that's the whole here we're looking at hypertonicity. Here we're looking at hypotonicity. Water out, water in, vis-a-vis the cell. Capillary walls, etc. They typically go in the anterior end of the capillary, resorptions at the venule end. Anything that isn't picked up that should be picked up, eventually will be picked up by the lymphatics, if that's the case, because not everything squeezes nicely into a very teeny tiny capillary. Okay? So that's it. Ions move selectively in and out. Nutrients, wastes, and gases typically go in. It's like oxygen's always going in, carbon dioxide's going always out. Nutrients are coming in, waste products are coming out. So that's sort of a universal thing that you can give a chart for all that. So it depends on how. So if you look at it this way, typically if you think that 8 ounces of water, so an ounce is 30 milliliters. So an 8-ounce glass is 240 milliliters. This is effectively 10 or slightly more than 10 glasses of water, approximately. However you ingest it, water or things. So whether it's just flavored with the tea, whatever the tea puts in it, and this Earl Grey, mind you. Earl Grey. Just tea and water, no additional sweeteners. Thank you very much. Okay. Ingested foods and beverages, we do produce some, as you might suspect, from metabolism. That's there. And of course, we have a certain amount of water loss that's insensible. It's just coming out, we're exhaling it. There's a little bit on the surface, about a half of a liter on the surface of your skin. But when you feel it, it's more than a half. So when you're perspiring, so it's what's called insensible perspiration. You may remember that. We talked a little bit about that in skin. And then actual perspiration and whatever urine and feces obviously play a role. Roughly the 280 to 300 milliosmoles, whether it stimulates thirst or inhibits antidiuretic hormone or etc., that type of thing. And they give you an idea. And you can take a look what your intake is. Beverages, 60%. Metabolism, relatively 10%. Foods, perhaps a more limited amount, 30%. That's there. And then where we get rid of everything else. That's part of it. So it's to me, that's useful. Obviously, thirst, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. That's really when we see increased, doesn't need to be a large increase, it's fairly sensitive. Dry mouth, drops in blood volume or blood pressure. And don't forget, because that is really a take-home point when you get to the final. We talk more about that whole renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. That's really the take-home piece for the final. I haven't finished working on the final yet. Give me something
No
to
rush.
do. It's I got time.
You do.
Is it online?
I'm thinking about it.
So that's
I'm thinking. Depends on if you're pleasant.
okay.
Probably wouldn't take a lot of doing for most of you. Okay, yeah, dry mouth, stomach and stress receptors. You can scroll through that. Obligatory water loss. Okay, lungs and skin, sensible. We know we're losing water from all these things that are there. Antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone are the big players, obviously, in water control and sodium and water control balance. We talked about that a lot. So decreased ADH, so you're trying to get rid of water, increasing, you're going to lead to concentrating the urine because you resorb the water. Okay. And again, it's all about the osmoreceptors right there. Different things that play a role in that they commented on. Significant changes in blood volume or blood pressure. Okay. Decreased blood pressure, increased antidiuretic hormone release, baroreceptors, renin-angiotensin mechanism, volume, and there's a lot of things that cause. It's interesting. Your body has so many of these compensatory mechanisms that are there, and you notice them. Because the next time, and there's a bug going around. If you didn't know, you probably know some folks. Cause like my son and his significant other had it in their household over the weekend. It's like all of a sudden they're vomiting and diarrhea. It's like, oh my God, they're probably passing. It's probably just a viral gastroenteritis. But he told me he felt sicker yesterday than he did when he had COVID. And ended up getting one of those IVs with the monoclonal antibodies. So, I mean, you really has a significant degree of impact, fluid imbalances. So the universal thing we say to anybody, you push the clear liquids if you can, for the most part. That's really, it's a go-to thing. So here they just keep scrolling through that. What's dehydration, burns, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, water deprivation. People will tend to abuse diuretics, things like that. I think there's a subtle degree of overlap with eating disorders, particularly eating and purging, bulimics. It's just drives you nuts with that. Okay, limited urination, mouth feels funny, dry flush skin, and you can see what it can lead to that are there. I'm just showing you what's going on. Hypotonic hydration, overhydration, water intoxication. Okay, now excessive amounts of water lowers the sodium Okay, net osmosis of water into tissues and swelling of cells. And again, we don't often use when we infuse saline. What's called normal saline is normal because it's isotonic. Every so often for dehydration, you might utilize hypotonic saline. There are very limited uses for hypertonic saline. Okay, but I mean, this is the rare one. I'm sure I shared that story with you, didn't I, about some radio stunt that was on a station in LA. They thought they were being clever, and they had a couple of people drink. It was who could drink the most water.
Oh yeah, you said that.
Yeah, and it was
like
because it's for a weed system.
Yeah.
So they figured it would be clever to do it that way. Lady died. Winning, and a relatively youngish woman. I mean, wow. So things like that, yeah. I mean, we underestimate that. And what happens? Edema. This is not in the cell so much. It's an atypical accumulation. Normally, there's an underlying reason. 90% of the time, when we see edema, particularly on both sides, we're looking at kidney or cardiac aspects, because that's going to cause an overabundance in the cellular fluids that are there. When there's too much fluid in the system, the fluid goes out. Right there. So it's probably congestive heart failure, particularly on the right side, would yield that. Kidney problems would certainly yield because you can't excrete sufficiently. Unilateral edema, to me, much more likely an obstacle. So we look for tumors, sometimes in pregnancy, because babies typically tend, in general, as they grow during pregnancy, more left-sided than right-sided. Obviously, that's transient with those types of things. And then the overwhelming problem of electrolytic imbalances. So really the salts are paramount when we begin to that, because of everything. We spent a whole semester talking about resting membrane potentials and movement across membranes and cardiac and neurological and musculoskeletal phenomena, all based on that. So you can't underscore the importance of it. So I will tell you how. Here's what happened to me when I had that salmonella that put me in 2006. One of the things I noted when I was unable to get out of the bathroom for very long was all of a sudden my legs would go into involuntary spasm. It's like, ugh. It's not like the typical thing as you get older, you get what we call Charlie horses, you get spasms. You usually just have to maybe get out of bed, put your foot on the floor, and it kind of eases up. No. It's like it would never go away.
Yeah. Oh,
So
they can be crippling.
BAT, big ass trouble.
The worst is for your for football. I would always during practices, I wouldn't stay hydrated enough. And one time I was sleeping in our 2-hour break.
Right.
And I had the worst Charlie horse, and no one was with to a quiet place. I had to fix it myself. It was very painful, worst experience of my life. I was writhing in pain.
You can see, it's for young people. It's usually from physical exertion and failure to hydrate, and then atmospheric conditions. You see it more in soccer toward the end of the game. We'll see a lot, and they'll be down. Somebody will be trying to press out the spasm. Just trying to do that. Now typically now they're doing more of the hydration breaks. They instituted them over this because it's Ramadan now.
Oh,
and with trying to deal with things like that. So blah, 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 blah. You can look through that chart if you wish. So where do we find these electrolyte deficiencies? Addison's disease is a limitation of the amount of aldosterone. You might remember when I talked about endocrine, that was famously the condition, and it's inevitably going to shorten your lifespan, that the late President John F. Kennedy had. He would probably have died young in any event, obviously being assassinated.
No way the CIA took care of that.
Okay, a conspiracy theorist.
Well, you're not saying, come on, he was definitely whacked by our.
I don't know who whacked him. By somebody, I mean, other than.
You're.
I was all into that for a long time. I was all into that. My generation was defined And I've said it many times that I could never have had a relationship with somebody, marry somebody who wasn't alive then, because that was our context. Was that. Anybody who was the member of 62 could tell you exactly where they were. That's my age. And we were just when we heard the news, I was in science lab, and I remember sitting outside when we heard he died. I was sitting outside at junior high school with that, just like it was yesterday. So Addison's disease was that. Here's another one. You don't see it as much as lead poisoning. Okay. And we had Pica was specifically about lead. And when we used to deal with that, when I was a resident a little bit more, we had something called BAL, British Anti-Leucite, that we would utilize to try to deal with. It was something you were alert to because there's so many old buildings, zoning, asbestosis. Okay. And so there's a lot of problems associated with it. Sodium obviously predominates. Okay, of the typical 300, you can see how much is sodium. It's the one that exerts the osmotic pressure aspect of thing. We know all about the pumping with it, resting membrane potential, moves back and forth in the extracellular fluid, kidney occupied. So concentration of sodium is the determining factor of the extracellular fluid, and obviously plays, along with potassium, that significant role with resting membrane potential and excitability. Okay, total body content determines the volume and blood pressure. So here you're looking more along at that membrane impact when it talks about concentration and content, more with volume, if you want to read it that way. I'm just trying to hear if there's anything irrelevant. Yeah, and again, normally when we're trying to deal with blood pressure, other than the kidney adjusting it autonomously with either creating more filtrate or limiting the amount of filtrate, the next go-to is really sodium when we trigger that renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, and voila, here it is. Aldosterone. 60 for regardless of aldosterone, 65% proximal convoluted tubules, 25% nephron loops. It's never secreted into the filtrate. So what happens? Sodium is actively reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts, etc. So the extracellular volume, and again, it's the same thing. We pull back into sodium, water follows. And if it's not, if aldosterone is low, it's not actively reabsorbed, and we tend to lose it in the urine that's there. So it's right with that juxtaglomerular complex or apparatus, whatever term you want to use. It responds to sympathetic nervous system stimulation, decreased filtrate concentrations, decreased stretch of granular cells due to decreased blood pressure. So that, and I think that these are useful to remember or be aware of when we, like, as part of, to me, it's not going to be specific on the final, but this is more with regard to questions on the kidney in the final, how to be. Renin catalyzes the angiotensin into angiotensin 2 eventually by way of that angiotensin converting enzyme plays a role in it. And then that angiotensin 2, 4 things it does, remember those. Its primary effect, its most major effect, let me phrase it like that, is the release of is generating aldosterone, because aldosterone really is a big player in blood pressure by pulling back in sodium and therefore water. Direct action on blood vessel, its name tells you, angio, blood vessel, tensing, and then increasing your thirst and increasing antidiuretic hormone production or secretion. So you can see it's like that. So elevated potassium in the extracellular fluid can also play a role. In general, when sodium goes in, potassium goes out. And that's what was, as I told you when we did the kidney, in the early days of diuretics, most of them they developed one called spironolactone, which was, and then they mixed that with an aldosterone lookalike, and it was called aldactone. And they were trying to generate something that was more potassium sparing, and then having people do more with regard to potassium supplementation. It's another good dietary thing. It came to spasms, and you see it if you're, well, I mean, the weather was not for what was going on in Augusta and the Masters. It was
Well, that was bad. That-
pretty bad weather. Although yesterday was okay. Because, you'll see what those guys eat, the supplements that they eat. There's a lot of bananas being eaten. That's a really useful source of potassium. Very, very comparatively rapid. Just made some killer banana nut bread.
I just made banana bread for the weekend.
Easiest recipe in the world. So Addison's disease, we talked about this, hypovolemia, there's a lot of things, natriuretic peptide, over high blood pressure, stretches the atrium, decreases blood pressure, inhibits ADH, renin and aldosterone. So it's sort of like the anti-aldosterone, if you want to think of it that way. Other factors that play a role: estrogens, increased sodium chloride resorption, like aldosterone, particularly water retention, menstrual cycles, and pregnancy. Very, very well known. Progesterone decreases sodium resorption, blocks aldosterone, so it's a little bit different where we are cyclically within the cycle. And the interesting thing, the glucocorticoids, which was the go-to treatment for so many years for immunological diseases, putting people on steroids, prednisone, prednisolone, all those types of things. That was one of the difficulties with it, because we were dealing other than impacting glucose and elevating it, a lot of people were having edema. The baroreceptors we talked about vis-a-vis blood vessels, they are the primary control. I think that they work on the heart very efficiently. They work on heart rate and force of contraction, but they are playing a role in, as you can see, alerting the brain that there are irregularities in blood pressure. And when they happen, okay, the sympathetic nervous system, so if there's too much, it declines that. So we get dilation, increases infiltration, sodium and water output, reducing it. That's there. And so you can look through those as well. Potassium, the big player, obvious in all resting membrane potential, particularly muscle, particularly cardiac muscle, the big problem with arrhythmias. Okay, increases in the extracellular fluid, hyper K, decreases resting membrane potential, depolarization, impacts idokel, but from too much, decreases hyperpolarization and non-responsiveness. So when we disrupt it in the heart, it really plays a significant role with regard to something we really are attuned to, are arrhythmias. So it's very, very impactful in that regard. Buffering systems, they comment on the buffering systems where it's regulated. So in the interest of time, I'm just kind of giving you this again contextually. And so the factor is extracellular fluid. So dietarily, it's where you can put it in. Low potassium diet or accelerated potassium loss reduces secretion and promotes limited reabsorption. Aldosterone helps you get, if sodium's going one way, potassium's going the other. I think you have to be careful with salt substitutes. I was just thinking a way to phrase it. I think if you're going to use salt, depending on your preferences, particularly as you get older, you begin to be a little less salt oriented, which does not apply in our house. I'm here to tell you. You guys are probably like my kids when they got French fries at McDonald's, they dipped them in salt. No?
They're salty enough.
I know, but my kids would, or my daughter dipping in the Frosty from Wendy's. And so here you can see a lot of problems with aldosterone irregularities. Calcium and phosphates about parathyroid hormone. Talked enough about that. Something you can look at there. I'm not going to go over it. In its idea, when you're looking at extracellular fluid, calcium is so significant for neuromuscular activities, its role in secretory activity, nerve signaling, membrane permeability, all of those things. If it's in the extracellular fluid, and it's different whether it's extracellular or intracellular calcium, and the role that when we talked about that. Chloride, you don't need a whole lot to do with it. Which brings us to the final topic. I really just wanted to spend the last 10, 15 minutes about pH. We know the pH typically goes between 7.4 plus or minus 0.05. As long as you're in that range, you're good. It doesn't take much. Obviously, it's an exponential number. So we're dealing with a scale, the way I would phrase it, it's not unlike the Richter scale. It doesn't take, 7.4 to 7.3 may not seem like a big jump. It's a big jump. When someone gets to 7.33, 7.32, they're significantly acidic. Or in the other direction, 7.47, 7.48, they're significantly alkalotic. Your enzyme systems rely on two major factors to keep them working: temperature, pH. Those are the big players in the configuration of proteins, which are enzymes. So systems start to either shut down or don't work properly. We eat a lot of acidic things, okay, in food. We use them extensively. Our palate is much more oriented toward a glass of milk is slightly acidic. Coffee or tea is slightly acidic. Cola-based soft drinks are slightly acidic. We squeeze lemon juice. I can't even tell you on how many things in cooking. Yeah, well, my wife and I just watched for 8 weeks the Food Network Tournament of Champions. Fascinating. I mean, there's a lot. It's for brightness or acidity. They want that. You want to stimulate all those different taste buds that are there. Lactic acid, fatty acids, all of those types of things that are there. We deal with them with buffering systems. We deal with them with respiration. We deal with them in the kidney. So the first line are the buffers that exist. The second line, altering our respirations to blow off or not blow off. And lastly, we rely on the kidneys. The kidneys take a longer period of time. We know the difference between strong and weak acids. Not going to go all into that tub. It's just these totally ionized versus partially ionizing. So the major buffering systems: bicarbonate, phosphate, proteins. Spent a lot of time on the bicarbonate one. You should review it. That are there. So we begin to see if the strong base added, it causes bicarbonate to dissociate and donate a proton. So it effectively, the beauty of the carbonic acid buffer is it can absorb or it can release protons. That's the beauty of having a relatively weak acid that's there without going into all the nuances. Same thing with the phosphate buffer. Components of sodium salts of dihydrogen phosphate or monohydrogen phosphate, weak acids and weak bases. It's not so much a role in plasma, but it plays a role in urine and intracellular fluid because of the amount of phosphate. There's a lot of phosphate in urine, okay? Generally, we pull calcium back in, we get rid of phosphate. Because most of the time it travels as calcium phosphate. So you can see it here. Proteins, in general, are amphoteric. So you can either accept it or not, or donate it. Again, intracellular buffer like hemoglobin. So we have all of these different buffers that are there where they play a role. Where are the problems? Okay. Respiratory and renal are more physiological buffering systems. Okay. They're not as rapid as the chemical buffers, the ones that are in the bloodstream. Respiratorily, it's all about blowing off CO2 more so than less so. So if when you're starting to tend toward that stop, you're working out, you're respiring more rapidly, and you know that. Okay, CO2 unloading, the reaction shift, and the H plus is incorporated back into bicarbonate and blah 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 blah. And all that stuff. So, in the same thing, if the PCO2, which is such a big factor, increases respiratory rate, this is where producing more of it for being more metabolically active. So they tend to summarize it. So this is the way I look at it. You have respiratory acidosis and metabolic acidosis. The most common cause of metabolic acidosis, diabetes. Because you're producing those ketone bodies, which are inherently acidic, when it gets out of control. And that is when we see people in what's called ketoacidosis crisis. The way of controlling it, other than immediately, with a variety of measures, like adding bicarb intravenously and things along those, it's basically controlling the sugar. The other one is respiratory acidosis. That's mostly chronic respiratory diseases. Your respiratory system, your ability to blow off CO2 is impacted. Those are the common ones. The uncommon ones are the alkalosis. Metabolic alkalosis, typically people eating tons and tons of basically antacid substances. Give it that.
Too many times.
Right. Too many times, too many Rolaids, whatever you're doing, because you're really adding, and really the underlying disease is the critical piece. Why are you doing it? Is there an ulcer? Or is it to compensate for the food you're eating, or you're drinking too much, or whatever you maybe shouldn't be drinking? Versus respiratory alkalosis, which is almost exclusively hyperventilating. And that, and that breathing in the paper bag still works for the most part. Hypoventilation, respiratory acidosis, hyperventilation, respiratory alkalosis. So the volatile carbonic acid by eliminating CO2 in the lungs, the non-volatile fixed acids, phosphoric, uric, lactic ketones, kidneys play a role in this, and also leveling things out that are there. So I wanted to share that with you. And then they talk about the alkaline reserve. So you can get very detailed with this, which we're not going to do. Because you've seen some of these before. Foods can generate a certain amount of acidity, and they have to balance it appropriately. And I think we know that. Different types of things. And again, you're getting very, very detailed. Mostly vis-a-vis kidney. Try to think if there's anything else that's relevant for us. It's the part I was dealing with. Okay. Typically, respiratory failures are associated with it, and we look closely at PCO2. Metabolically, other organisms other than those by the PCO2, we look at. So we might look at bicarbonate levels as an indicator, but there's other ways to check that are there. So if the PCO2 is above 45, we're looking at respiratory acidosis, can be acid-base imbalances, mostly here. Emphysema, pneumonia, cystic fibrosis, respiratory alkalosis, hyperventilation due to stress or pain. You can understand that. Metabolically, things that can play a role into this. So obviously alcohol can play a role into this. Persistent diarrhea because you're losing bicarb, because you're really screwing up. Vomiting and diarrhea make havoc with pH. Lactic acid, exercise, shock, something that you'd have to deal with. Exercise, typically you're going to stop. But diabetic crises, starvation, problems with the kidney. Metabolic alkalosis, much less common. Again, maybe some vomiting, maybe playing a role. This is really the big one, over-ingestion of antacids. So if you don't get that pH under control, because it gets below 7 or above 7.8, oh boy. Your compensatory mechanisms are not going to be able to play a role that are associated with it. And I think that's everything. To summarize, we underestimate it, but it's one of the first things if you're going to go into a clinical field, when people have respiratory or metabolic diseases, you have to look at it in the context of abnormalities. So this afternoon, and we'll end up listening to a few presentations. Then I would like, and I'll send another email companion. And I'll send an email about the exam. So we will not, if you want to take the exam in here, take the exam in here. Okay. Here. You can take it anywhere. Okay. You don't have to be there. I'll get the results. If there's a problem, and I'll send an email, text me. I'll be around, but just shoot a text to me. To me, it's all about, you got to be careful not to you can go back and forth on these as you go, but every so often somebody gets kicked off. And the other reminder is your time. Okay? So time can play a role. We'll figure all that out as time goes on. All right. All good. Goodbye. So anybody else who can do presentations, start letting me know, and we'll get it set up either in here.